This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 947 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Before I get to the trends this week, I want to remind you to check out Underdog. Right now over on Underdog, you can draft teams for playoff contests. That's right, it's November, so you may feel like it's a little bit early for this, but you can get ahead of the field if you have a good grasp on which teams are going to make the playoffs and which teams won't make the playoffs. To check those contests out, along with a ton of other variations, head to UnderdogFantasy.com and sign up with promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you a nice deposit offer, and it'll also get you a link to my rest of season rankings. That's if you sign up with promo code LATEROUND, make a deposit, and start playing. Now let's get to these trends. Remember when the Jets were a really tough matchup for quarterbacks? Well, that hasn't been the case for some time. From week 1 to week 5, the highest quarterback finish from a quarterback facing the Jets was QB 21. They didn't face the most amazing quarterback lineup, but none of those quarterbacks scored higher than their season-long averages against the Jets. Since then, the Jets have given up 4 top 5 performances. All but one quarterback, that one being CJ Stroud, has scored above their season-long average when facing the Jets. The Jets may look a little scary on paper, but it's really not that tough of a matchup anymore. The Eagles have gone in the complete opposite direction as the Jets. They started the season off as a moderately beatable defense, but things have changed. Philly now ranks as the second toughest matchup against quarterbacks. This is by adjusted fantasy points allowed. They're the 6th toughest matchup against running backs. They're the toughest matchup against wide receivers, and they're the 4th toughest matchup against tight ends. They've been unreal against wide receivers of late. Since week 4, they've allowed one single wide receiver to rank higher than wide receiver 40 in weekly scoring. Just one. And that was Jamar Chase, who's beating everyone right now. That's it. We saw them hold Terry McLaurin just last week. CeeDee Lamb was wide receiver 40 a couple of weeks ago. Brian Thomas did nothing. Malik Neighbors back in week 7, he did very little. The list goes on and on. The Eagles' defense in total is probably the toughest defense in fantasy right now. So Shane Waldron was out as offensive coordinator in week 11. And I talked about how that shifted the Bears' backfield a little bit on the 15 Transactions episode. But what it also did was get Gerald Everett out of the picture because Waldron seemed to have some infatuation with him. Cole Kmet, though, ended up running a route on 95% of Chicago's dropbacks against the Packers. That was the first time all season where he was above the 90% mark. I think Shane Waldron was the only person on earth who thought it was a good idea to let Gerald Everett get run over Cole Kmet. But it looks like rational thought has finally prevailed. Let's do a little Mark Andrews update. In week 10, Andrews played without Isaiah Likely. That led to his best usage of the season. He ran a route on 94% of Baltimore's dropbacks that week. That was by far a season high. It was the only game of his season where he reached a 20% target share. The big question after week 10 was, would that continue? I had him as a sell on the 15 Transaction show because I was nervous that it wouldn't continue. All while recognizing that if it did continue, then we would be looking at old Mark Andrews, like elite production from Mark Andrews. Well, unfortunately, the Ravens did what they've been doing all season long in week 11. Andrews ran around on 58% of Baltimore's dropbacks. He had a 9.7% target share. That was his lowest mark since week 4. It's beyond frustrating. Trust me, I'm with you. But this is how the Ravens are operating after 11 weeks of football. We have to accept it. The Broncos are truly going with a hot hand approach at running back. That's what it looks like. Everyone, including myself, thought that things were about to change in that backfield after Audric Estime handled 82% of the team's running back rushes in week 10. And then the Broncos went back to Javonte Williams. Estime had a running back rush share of 29% in week 11. Javonte Williams played 32 snaps, Estime 14. This is the definition of better in best ball. This backfield looks like it's going to be completely unpredictable week to week for the rest of the year. Kenneth Walker had been seeing great pass catching usage for most of the season, but over the last handful of games, things have slowed down a little bit. He's now seen single-digit percentage target shares in 3 of his last 4 games. He's averaging a 10% target share per game rate over this time. That number was 15% during his first 4 games this season. But I would not be concerned at all. Walker actually saw a 66% route participation rate in Week 11. That was the highest of his season by a relatively decent margin. What that tells us is that he just wasn't targeted at that high of a rate in Week 11. That's going to happen in some games. I would anticipate things normalizing, especially if he keeps up that type of route rate. On Thursday last week, Mike McCarthy said that Rico Dowdle is, quote, the lead back, and then he followed that up by saying, quote, Rico needs to touch the ball. Well, guess what? Nothing really changed. Now, game script and performance can obviously play a role here, but Dowdle played 49% of Dallas's snaps on Monday night. That was barely above his season-long average. It was lower than what he had seen in Week 9 and Week 10. Dowdle was at a 67% running back rush share. That was right in line with where he's been at. His 9.4% target share was actually a 4-week low. And his 39% route participation, that was right at his season-long average. Dowdle is probably the most talented back in that backfield, but I'm not sure it matters at this point. I was around the market, maybe even a couple of spots lower with Jaden Reed entering the year. He wasn't a target for me, and he wasn't an avoid either. Then at the start of the year, I was pacing ahead of the market with my rest of season rankings. Even with the lack of target share that Reed was seeing, I thought they'd surely try to get him the ball more because he was balling out to start the year. Well, over the last 5 or 6 weeks, I've been significantly lower than the market when comparing my rest of season rankings to the experts over at Fantasy Pros. And that's related to Jaden Reed. And it's because the Packers just aren't using him enough. Jaden Reed has hit a 20% target share just twice this season. Let me read you his target shares over the last 5 weeks. 19%, 12%, 11%, 16%, and 12%. That's not going to cut it. I don't care how efficient he is. Packers coaches should be embarrassed by that kind of usage. But that is his usage. And that's why there's reason to be more bearish with Reed. Pat Freiermuth has kind of become dust with Russell Wilson under center. Not that he was dominating beforehand. But he's averaging just a 9% target share per game rate during Wilson's 4 starts. He has 10 targets. His route share, it's maybe dropped a tad, but he's being targeted a lot less than he was earlier this season. Darnell Washington has actually out-targeted Freiermuth over these 4 games, 12-10, despite running 40% of the number of routes that Freiermuth's running. Washington has a targets per route run rate of 26% over the last 4. That's according to Fantasy Life. Freiermuth is at 9%. Now, I'm not saying Washington is all of a sudden a stream-worthy play. I'm just saying that Pat Freiermuth definitely is not. The last trend this week is something I talked about earlier in the season, but Brock Purdy continues to run more this year. His scramble rate is 10%. Last year, it was 4%. That's according to PFF. The year before, 3%. That's resulted in Purdy giving us 5.1 rush attempts per game. In 2023, that number was 2.4. He's given us 26.7 rushing yards per game this year. He was at 9 last year. Now, Purdy's regressed as a passer across the board, statistically. He's not a worse quarterback. He's just not doing things at such an unsustainable rate. His touchdown rate this year is 4.2%. It was over 7% during his first 2 years. His yards per attempt has dropped by 1.1 yards year over year. But what's kept him afloat in fantasy football is rushing. And I'm not sure anyone was prepared for that. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you had subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Late Round QB. I'm on Blue Sky as well, also at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly Sleeper Show.